COVID is an extraordinary crisis in many ways. Most importantly is that it's global and that it's deep. If you look back at the 2008-2010 crisis, that originated in the financial systems of rich countries, in large measure due to their incompetence at managing their own financial systems. This has come as a pandemic and it's everywhere. But the poor countries are hit particularly hard. Their health systems are weaker, their social security systems are weaker. And on top of that, they're seeing remittances, which are enormously important in many countries, more important than foreign direct investment, fall by larger amounts than we have seen since records began. We have seen capital flight. We've seen falling commodity prices, which is important for many developing countries. And we have seen a drop in tourism, which again is important for many developing countries. Further, they cannot borrow in their own currency. If they want to borrow, they usually have to borrow in dollars or euros or sterling or whatever. So what we're seeing this time round, very different from the crisis of 2008-10, is that it's much, much more severe for developing countries. And that's worrying in itself, but it's also worrying if you look at the conversation in the rich countries, which is almost entirely internal. This is a truly global crisis. We are at a moment in the world where we're seeing a redefinition of the relationships between the big powers. And the three blocs are indeed the three biggest economies are the United States, China, and Europe. Those relationships were changing. We all know that. They've been changing for a long while since the rise of China became stronger and stronger. And with the rising nationalism and inward-looking nature of politics in many parts of the world, particularly the United States. So that story of the rising power has been there for 20 or 30 years. But what we've seen is that COVID on top of this is putting a great strain on the relationships. There are accusations about the ability to manage it, accusations about the origins of the crisis. But I do think that if we look more positively, we should be able to see this as something on which, in principle at least, they could work together. I hope that Europe and China will take the opportunity of COVID and the opportunity of the climate crisis to work together in a much more strong and constructive way than we have seen. Because we have to see that those crises of climate, COVID, biodiversity are intimately linked. Most of the pathogens that affect humans come in a zoonotic way, which means they come from animals. And what climate and biodiversity change do is they change dramatically the way in which wild animals, human animals, and domestic animals come together as groups and within those groups. And what you see is as we change those relationships so strongly through climate change and the great crisis in biodiversity, we see new forms of interaction. And that means new forms of viruses emerging, some of which will be nasty. And we've seen bird flu and swine flu and Ebola and HIV/AIDS and MERS and SARS and now COVID-19, all in the recent past. So what we have to recognize is that if we want to tackle COVID, we have to tackle climate change and biodiversity at the same time. And these issues of global health and global climate are issues on which we should be able to get together, that we see, as it were, a common enemy, a shared enemy, and we can work against those together. I do think that Europe and China are starting to see that. So I do see that as an opportunity. I hope that the United States will eventually come. I mean, we have a presidential election in the United States, of course, in November. and a change there could really help enormously in bringing the world together around those two issues. There'll be conflicts about trade. There'll be conflicts about intellectual property rights. There'll be conflicts about investment. There'll be conflicts about security. So it's very important that we find at least some parts of our mutual relationship which can be positive and working together. And COVID, climate, biodiversity are huge challenges for humankind. And I would hope that they would be the shared challenge that could bring nations together. That is something that cannot be taken for granted, that we'd have to work for. Brazil is of fundamental importance to the future of humankind, to the future of the planet, because it is so rich in the Amazon. And of course, it's not just the Amazon, it's all the grasslands and how they're used, because those are enormously important for storing carbon, or indeed releasing carbon if we manage them badly. So the relationship with Brazil is indeed fundamental. And it seems to me that we have to work in a collaborative way, but we also may have to be quite strong on sanctions. Brazil depends in large measure on the export of food, agricultural products. If someone is selling to you a carpet which is made with child labor, you would not want to buy it. If somebody is going to sell you fish which has been produced in a way which dramatically runs down the stocks or destroys other parts of marine life, you'd be very cautious about buying that. If you have products that are made in a way that deeply damage our shared environment, our climate, then it seems to me that you should be prepared to say, I'm sorry, we are not buying those products. And so I think some kinds of sanctions will be important, but not only sanctions. There is a lot that we can do as a world to put in place rewards to looking after the forests. And that, I think, is something where we have to keep going. There is a history of that in relation to Brazil. So I think we have to work with a combination of sanctions and of encouragement and investment. But we can't just sit back and let it happen. It's too big and it's too important. We also have to bear in mind that Brazil, like many other countries, most countries, all countries, has its internal politics. And those are playing through. And there are very many good people in Brazil who are standing up for the environment, who see the dangers in what is happening now, who actually see the links between climate and COVID. And Brazil is doing very badly on COVID at the same time as it's doing very badly on the forests and on climate. And the internal politics in Brazil will play their way through as well. The role of different governments in these crises has been quite striking. And you've seen probably the two most successful prime ministers or presidents, chancellors, as Angela Merkel and Jacinda Ardern. Those are two people whose respect has gone up enormously through the way in which they and their country have handled the crisis. They're also two people who have been acting strongly on climate as well. It's very interesting that the great investment stories that you're seeing now in Germany as a result of the crisis in Germany and in Europe have been very strongly focused on a green response, a green recovery, a sustainable recovery. Those boosts have been very focused there. So what you're seeing, I think, in those two examples is something very important. You're seeing people who understand climate, people who understand science of climate, people who understand the science of COVID and are prepared to act are doing much better. So I would not put this crisis as in conflict with action on climate. I think people are starting to see the connections between COVID and pandemics and climate. They're starting to see the importance of building back better. They want something that's different. They see the dangers, the fragility, the inequities, the pollution of the old system, and they're looking for something different. So if you think of these two phenomena, COVID and climate, as being about understanding science, if you see that the leadership on one is associated with the leadership on the other, if you take the spirit in many peoples across the world of wanting something different, I think that this is a special moment where we have a chance to move strongly on policy on climate. Of course, a carbon price is a major part of that, but it's only a part of that. And there's so much more you can do in terms of the kind of projects you prioritize. For example, planting trees, retrofitting buildings, rooftop solar, extending broadband, looking after grasslands and peatlands, looking after water. These are all ways in which we can act quickly and strongly to build a much more sustainable green recovery. So I think that if we act as a world well, and we can see examples of that, I said in the European recovery package, in the way in which New Zealand has behaved, if we take this opportunity, I think the COVID crisis could be the beginnings of a stronger commitment to climate and biodiversity issues as well. This is all about building a sustainable recovery. COVID has been a very complex crisis in the way in which it affects different sectors of the economy, in the way it affects different people, and particularly in the way it affects different generations, different age groups. We know that older people are more vulnerable, and as such, they have been groups which have been especially protected. But we also know that keeping children out of school is deeply damaging to their health and to their mental health, their physical health, to their future prospects. So young people may be less likely to die from COVID, but they can have, in many ways, still bigger effects on their livelihoods and indeed their health now and in the future as a result of the economic crisis created by COVID. Hunger will be going up, mental health issues will be going up, damaged education is a damaged prospect for the future. So the impact of COVID is very different across the generations, but I think it is particularly severe for young people through education, mental health, and so on. And that is something that we really ought to worry about. So we might think of Africa as being a young nation, as a young continent. And so the young people will pick up and carry on after COVID, having lost a few old people. But I think that would be too crude and too simplistic. I think that the impacts on young people are deep and severe, and they have to be absolutely central to our notion of building back better. How do we give the young people who suffered with a loss of education, who might have suffered with the loss of parents, whose mental health has been under great stress, how do we invest in them? How do we invest in education systems alongside health systems to give our young people a better chance?